Every year, the U.S. government recruits thousands of people to do the most dangerous job in law enforcement. Not agents, not soldiers, but ordinary men and women asked to go back into the organizations that could end their lives and keep talking. They are promised protection. Some receive it. Many do not. The cases in this video span 4 decades. They involve a DEA agent taken off a street in broad daylight, a federal pilot whose name most people have never heard, a decorated war hero silenced 6 weeks after a conviction he helped secure, and an entire town reduced to ash because one person was suspected of having talked. They involve corrupt generals, hackers, cartel lawyers, and the highest-ranking Mexican law enforcement official ever prosecuted in a United States federal court. The one thing every person on this list had in common is that they gave information to American authorities. Some did it for money, some did it for protection, some did it because they believed it was the right thing to do. None of them were protected enough. Case 1. Enrique "Kiki" Camarena, the DEA agent who got too close. On Thursday, February 7, 1985, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena left the American consulate in Guadalajara, Mexico, to meet his wife Mica for lunch. 3 weeks after that lunch, Kiki was scheduled to transfer back to the United States. 4.5 years in Mexico, chasing some of the most powerful drug traffickers in the world, and he was finally going home. 5 armed men were waiting outside the consulate. They surrounded him on the street, forced him into a car, and drove away. That was the last time anyone outside the cartel saw him alive. His body was found a month later, on March 5, 1985, wrapped in plastic in a shallow grave in the state of Michoacán, roughly 60 miles from Guadalajara. He was 37 years old. He left behind his wife and 3 sons, Enrique, Daniel, and Eric. Kiki Camarena was the man who had personally cost Mexico's most powerful cartel billions of dollars. They had decided he was going to pay for it. Kiki was born in Mexicali, Mexico in 1947. His family moved to Calexico, California, where he grew up and became an American citizen. After high school, he joined the Marines in 1968, served 2 years, then came home and worked as a firefighter, a Calexico police officer, and an Imperial County deputy sheriff, before joining the DEA in June 1974. By 1980, after years working undercover in Fresno, he transferred to the DEA's Guadalajara office. He moved there with his wife and children. What he found disturbed him immediately. 3 men, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero, controlled the majority of drug trafficking routes from Mexico into the United States. They were paying off Mexican police, intelligence officials, and government figures so thoroughly that law enforcement would not go near them. DEA agents in Mexico had no enforcement power. They could only gather information and pass it to Mexican authorities. Mexican authorities were on the cartel's payroll. Kiki was known for his ability to build trust with informants. His supervisors said nobody else in the Guadalajara office could convince people to step into dangerous situations and keep returning. Through those informants, he mapped the cartel's operations piece by piece, until by 1984, he knew exactly what he had found. The cartel was farming on a scale law enforcement had never encountered. A 2,500-acre plantation in Chihuahua called Rancho Buffalo generated an estimated $8 billion annually. Kiki and Mexican pilot Alfredo Zavala Avelar, a DEA asset who flew missions with him regularly, took aerial photographs of the property and brought the evidence to DEA leadership and the American ambassador. The find was significant enough that Kiki delayed his return to the United States to see the operation through. On November 7, 1984, 450 Mexican soldiers, assisted by DEA agents, raided Rancho Buffalo. Thousands of workers were on site. The entire plantation was burned to the ground. Time magazine called it the bust of the century. The financial damage to the Guadalajara cartel ran into the billions. The cartel believed the information had come from inside the DEA. In the months that followed, the three bosses held meetings. Evidence later presented in court confirmed that attendees included Mexico's Secretary of the Interior, the country's defense minister, the head of Mexico's Interpol office, and the governor of the state of Jalisco, all receiving cartel payments. The agenda was to identify who was responsible and eliminate them. They believed it was Kiki. They were correct. On February 7, 1985, the 5 men who grabbed Kiki outside the consulate worked for Mexico's Federal Security Directorate, the country's own intelligence agency operating on the cartel's payroll. They drove him to a house at 881 Lope de Vega in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood of Guadalajara, a property owned by Caro Quintero. That same afternoon, a second team took Alfredo Zavala Avelar from near the Guadalajara airport and brought him to the same house. What happened over the next 30 hours was later documented through forensic evidence, audio recordings recovered from the property, and testimony from people present. The cartel wanted to know 2 things: how much the DEA knew about their operations, and which Mexican officials had been exposed. A doctor was brought in specifically to keep both men conscious so questioning could continue. Kiki and Alfredo were both dead by February 9, 1985. Their bodies were wrapped in plastic, transported to a rural area outside the town of La Angostura in Michoacán, and left in a shallow roadside grave. Authorities found them on March 5th. In May 1985, the DEA launched Operation Leyenda, the largest homicide investigation in the agency's history. Caro Quintero had already fled to Costa Rica, allowed to leave Guadalajara Airport on a private jet after a Mexican federal judicial police chief accepted a reported $300,000 bribe. That officer was fired and charged. Caro Quintero was arrested in Costa Rica on April 4, 1985. Fonseca Carrillo was taken in Puerto Vallarta the same month. Felix Gallardo, whose political connections ran deeper, avoided arrest until 1989. All 3 were convicted in Mexican courts and sentenced to 40 years each, the maximum permitted under Mexican law at the time. Operation Leyenda produced 10 separate trials in Los Angeles and 4 U.S. federal convictions in 1992. Fonseca Carrillo was eventually granted home confinement in 2016 due to his age and health. Felix Gallardo remained in a Mexican prison. Caro Quintero walked free in August 2013 after serving 28 years, released on a legal technicality. He spent nearly a decade as a fugitive before the Mexican military recaptured him in July 2022. In February 2025, he was transferred to U.S. custody. On March 1, 2025, at age 72, he entered a Brooklyn federal courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and pleaded not guilty. More than 100 DEA agents filled the seats behind the prosecution. Kiki's widow, Mika, said the family had held on to hope for 14,631 days. The cartel removed Kiki to protect their operation. What they triggered instead was the chain of events that destroyed it entirely. And out of its wreckage came the Sinaloa cartel, the Tijuana cartel, and the Juarez cartel, organizations responsible for tens of thousands of deaths across the decades that followed. The next case on this list shows what happens when the system built to protect informants gets turned against them from the inside. Case 2. The man who sold the informant, Ivan Reyes Arzate, and the Beltran Leyva cartel. Every time the DEA shared sensitive intelligence with Mexico, that information passed through one man. Ivan Reyes Arzate was the highest-ranking officer of Mexico's Sensitive Investigative Unit, an elite law enforcement division created specifically to work alongside the DEA. He had trained at the DEA's own academy in Quantico, Virginia. The U.S. government trusted him with the identities of informants, details of ongoing operations, and the names of targets under surveillance. For years, he was described by American officials as a key partner in the fight against drug trafficking. He was on the cartel's payroll the entire time. Reyes Arzate, known inside the criminal world by the codename La Reina, Spanish for the Queen, joined the Sensitive Investigative Unit in 2008 and quickly rose to command it. He served as the main point of contact between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement on the most sensitive operations in the country. While doing that job, he was quietly feeding intelligence to two separate criminal organizations, the Beltran-Leyva cartel and later a cartel network linked to the Sinaloa organization. The DEA informant at the center of this case was a Colombian national. He had been working inside the Beltran-Leyva organization, one of Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking groups at the time. Between 2007 and 2008, for a period of roughly 6 to 7 months, the DEA used his intelligence to intercept the cartel's cocaine shipments. Boats and submarines carrying product from Colombia were seized, one after another. The Beltran-Leyva brothers were certain someone inside their operation was passing information to American agents. Arturo Beltran-Leyva, who led the organization, called a meeting in Cuernavaca, Mexico, in 2009. Multiple Mexican law enforcement officers attended, including Reyes Arzate. According to testimony later given in U.S. federal court by former cartel lieutenant Sergio Villarreal Barragan, a man known as El Grande, La Reina handed a cardboard binder to a senior officer at that meeting. The binder contained a photograph and the identity of the DEA's source inside the cartel, the Colombian informant. Arturo Beltran-Leyva looked at the photograph. He became very angry, Villarreal later testified. He ordered the man kidnapped immediately. Cartel operatives located the informant in a city in central Mexico, took him, and he was never seen alive again. According to the federal criminal complaint later filed against Reyes Arzate, the informant had been instrumental in securing a U.S. indictment against the cartel's leadership. He had given American investigators the information they needed to build a case. For that, he was hunted down and eliminated. Reyes Arzate, according to prosecutors, shared in a $3 million payment for identifying him. The betrayal did not stop there. Reyes Arzate continued working inside the Sensitive Investigative Unit for years after the informant's death. In 2016, he met with leaders of another criminal network and accepted a $290,000 bribe in exchange for warning them that their phones were being monitored by the DEA. That leak forced U.S. agents to evacuate a separate informant, one who had been paid more than $1 million for cooperation, out of Mexico for their own safety. DEA. Special Agent Matthew Sandberg, who had worked alongside Reyes Arzate and considered him a professional partner, later described the damage at sentencing. "It set the U.S. back incredibly," he said. The DEA was forced to freeze cooperation with multiple Mexican officials while they worked to identify the mole. That mole turned out to be the man they had trusted most. Investigators first grew suspicious when wiretapped communications began matching information that had been shared with Reyes Arzate. In one intercepted call, a cartel leader referred to someone named Ivan and described him as the boss. Reyes Arzate was confronted at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City in early 2017. He denied leaking anything, though he acknowledged he was the sole Mexican point of contact for the information that had been shared. In April 2017, he flew to Chicago and self-surrendered to federal authorities. He was charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to obstruct justice. In May 2018, he changed his plea to no contest, a legal term meaning he acknowledged the facts would support a guilty verdict without formally admitting guilt. At his sentencing hearing in November 2018, El Grande testified in person, wearing a prison jumpsuit, describing the Cuernavaca meeting and Arturo Beltran Leyva's reaction to seeing the informant's photograph. U.S. District Judge Harry Leinenweber sentenced Reyes Arzate to 40 months in prison. Prosecutors had asked for 10 years. Arturo Beltran Leyva was found and eliminated by Mexican naval forces in a confrontation in Cuernavaca on December 16, 2009, the same year the informant was taken. He never faced a courtroom. The informant he ordered removed had no name attached to his case in any public court filing. He remains unnamed in every document. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case shows that the cartel did not always need a corrupt official to find their target. Sometimes an ordinary newspaper article was enough to get someone eliminated. Case 3. The informant on his own street. José Daniel González Galeana. José Daniel González Galeana was living the kind of life that did not belong to someone running from a cartel. He owned a $365,000 two-story house in one of El Paso's most expensive neighborhoods. He had a swimming pool, a freight company, and a family. His neighbors on Pony Trail Drive included the El Paso police chief and the county district attorney. On paper, he looked like a successful businessman who had crossed the border and built something real. In reality, he was a lieutenant in the Juarez cartel, a federal informant for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and a man who knew exactly how much danger he was in. González Galeana, 37, had fled Mexico in 2008 after his direct boss, cartel lieutenant Pedro Aranas Sanchez, known as El Tigre, was arrested. Around the same time, Mexican authorities raided a cartel warehouse. 2 significant losses in quick succession, and cartel leadership in Ciudad Juarez, just across the Rio Grande from El Paso, began asking questions about who had been talking. ICE arranged a visa for González Galeana that allowed him to live legally in Texas. In exchange, he began providing information about the cartel's operations. But the arrangement was already compromised before it fully began. A Mexican newspaper published a report identifying González Galeana by name as the informant connected to El Tigre's arrest. According to court documents, once that story ran, he became a marked man. He told a witness directly that if certain people found him, he would not survive it. He knew the cartel's internal logic. Once a name was public, there was no path back. The man sent to find him was Ruben Rodriguez Dorado, 30, a mid-ranking member of the same Juarez cartel. ICE was also handling Rodriguez Dorado as a confidential informant. That detail, that both the target and the person hired to locate and eliminate him were simultaneously working as U.S. government informants, would later become one of the most embarrassing facts of the entire case. Rodriguez Dorado had told El Paso detectives when police first approached him for help on the investigation that he was the main man in El Paso for the cartel. Investigators later learned his specialty was coordinating contract operations against targets. He had been, in his own words to police, someone who followed intended victims until an operation could be carried out. The cartel official who gave Rodriguez Dorado the order and paid for the operation was Jesus Aguayo Salas, 33, who was based in Mexico. A warrant was issued for Aguayo's arrest. To carry out the operation on the ground in El Paso, Rodriguez Dorado recruited people he knew locally, including through a younger relative. He paid the cell phone bill of a contact to track González Galeana's location. He also called a tactical supply store to ask about specific ammunition in the hours before the operation, according to court documents. On the evening of May 15, 2009, Rodriguez Dorado, along with 18-year-old U.S. Army Private First Class Michael Jackson Apodaca and 17-year-old Christopher Duran, tracked González Galeana to a relative's home in the nearby community of Canutillo. They followed him as he drove back to his house on Pony Trail Drive. A 16-year-old also involved in surveillance was arrested separately. As González Galeana arrived home, Apodaca approached and fired 8 shots at close range. Duran drove the getaway car. Apodaca, who had enlisted in the Army in September 2008 and was assigned to the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade at Fort Bliss, was paid under $10,000 for the operation, nearly 3 times his monthly military salary. González Galeana's wife, Adriana Solis, had been told by her husband exactly what to do if something happened. Call ICE first, then call 911. She made both calls. He was dead on the street in front of their home. 10 days after the shooting, Apodaca, Duran, Rodriguez Dorado, and the 16-year-old were arrested on an unrelated theft charge. They had tried to steal a truckload of televisions from an El Paso dealership. Investigators linked them to the González Galeana shooting through that arrest and through phone records that placed all 3 at the scene. All 3 defendants were charged with capital murder and held on $1 million bond each. Apodaca cooperated with prosecutors and testified against his co-defendants in exchange for a life sentence, which was handed down in July 2013. Rodriguez Dorado also received a life sentence. Duran received 25 years after pleading guilty and agreeing to testify. Aguayo Salas, the cartel official who ordered and funded the operation, remained in Mexico with a warrant outstanding. González Galeana is believed to be the first-ranking cartel member to be eliminated on American soil. The next case took that pattern and made it larger. Not one person removed, but an entire town. Case 4. One leak, one town. The Allende massacre. Allende is a quiet ranching town in the Mexican state of Coahuila, about a 40-minute drive from Eagle Pass, Texas. In March 2011, it had a population of roughly 23,000 people. Most of them had no involvement with any cartel. Most of them did not know each other. What connected the ones who disappeared was something far simpler than criminal ties. They shared surnames: Garza, Gaitan, Moreno, Villanueva, with 2 men the Zetas cartel believed had spoken to American law enforcement. At least 100 people were taken and eliminated. The actual number is believed to be as high as 300. The chain of events that brought the Zetas to Allende started in Dallas, Texas. The DEA had launched a drug trafficking investigation called Operation Too Legit to Quit after a series of significant seizures, including $802,000 found vacuum-packed inside the gas tank of a pickup. Following those arrests, agents identified a Dallas-born man named Jose Vasquez Jr., known as El Diablo, as the leading Zetas cocaine distributor in East Texas. When agents moved to arrest him, Vasquez crossed the border into Mexico and sought shelter with cartel contacts in Allende. The DEA saw an opportunity. Instead of pursuing Vasquez on existing charges, agents pressured him to cooperate. His wife and mother were still living in Texas, and federal agents made clear they faced legal exposure if he did not help. Under that pressure, Vasquez worked to obtain something the DEA wanted: the trackable phone identification numbers for Miguel Ángel Trevino, known as Z40, and his brother Omar Trevino, known as Z42. The Trevino brothers were among the most wanted cartel figures in North America. Their phone numbers would allow American investigators to monitor their movements and communications. Vasquez obtained the numbers through a Zetas lieutenant named Héctor Moreno, whose brother was already in U.S. custody. The information was passed to the DEA. According to reporting by ProPublica, which investigated the massacre extensively, DEA supervisors then shared the information, including details of who had been cooperating, with a Mexican federal police unit. That unit was known to have connections to criminal organizations. The information reached the Trevino brothers. The Trevinos knew the leak had come from someone connected to Allende. They were not certain of the exact source, but they moved with no interest in precision. On the evening of Friday, March 18, 2011, armed Zetas operatives began arriving in Allende. They came with lists of surnames.
They went house to house, targeting anyone with a family connection to the men they believed had cooperated. Then they expanded outward, taking people connected to those people, and then people connected to them. The operation ran for 3 days across Allende and neighboring towns. Emergency services in Allende and the nearby city of Piedras Negras received 1,451 calls for help during those days. According to the National Human Rights Commission's investigation, not one call received a response. The Allende fire chief at the time later told ProPublica his department was threatened and stood down. Municipal police, far from responding to the violence, were present at several of the sites, and witnesses said officers took an active role in detaining people. At one ranch, a woman who drove past the following morning described seeing armed, hooded men inside the gates while police stood watch outside. Bodies were loaded into a building and incinerated. By 2014, when Mexican military and law enforcement began searching the area, they found clandestine grave sites across multiple ranches. What remained was mostly ash, fragments of bone, and small pieces of personal belongings. A definitive death toll was never established. U.S. Department of Justice proceedings confirmed at least 100 people lost their lives. Researchers and investigators who worked in the area concluded the number was likely 2 to 3 times higher. For years, families in Allende stayed silent. Filing a report meant identifying yourself as someone connected to the events, which meant risking the same fate. The massacre was not publicly known outside of Coahuila until 2014, 3 years after it happened. In U.S. courts, a senior Zetas figure named Hugo Cesar Roman Chavarria, known as El Vecino, meaning the neighbor, was identified in court testimony as having personally traveled through Allende with Zetas gunmen during the massacre, pointing out the homes of people connected to the suspected informants. He was extradited from Mexico to the United States on November 30, 2018. On August 23, 2019, he pleaded guilty to drug trafficking conspiracy. In September 2021, U.S. District Judge Sean Jordan sentenced him to life in prison in Plano, Texas. Jose Vasquez Jr., the informant whose cooperation the DEA had leveraged to obtain the phone numbers, was never charged in connection with the Allende deaths. Both he and Jose Luis Garza Gaitan, another man the Zetas suspected of cooperating, had already crossed into the United States before the operation began. The people of Allende did not make it out in time. The next case moves from a cartel striking an entire town to something more targeted. A man who spent years working as a lawyer for one of Mexico's most powerful cartel bosses, only to be hunted down in the parking lot of an upscale American shopping center. Case 5. The cartel lawyer who crossed the wrong man, Juan Jesus Guerrero Chapa. Juan Jesus Guerrero Chapa had built himself a quiet life in one of the wealthiest towns in America. He lived in a $1.2 million mansion in Southlake, Texas, a suburb northwest of Dallas, where crime was so rare that the city had not recorded a single person losing their life to violence in 14 years.
He lived there with his wife Julia and their 3 children. He had a burgundy Range Rover, a routine, and on the evening of May 22, 2013, a craving for frozen yogurt. He and Julia walked to Malicious at Southlake Town Square, ate their yogurt on a bench outside, then browsed the nearby shops. At 6:47 p.m., as Julia loaded bags into the back of the Range Rover, a white Toyota Sequoia pulled up. A gunman wearing a ski mask stepped out, walked to the passenger side window, and fired a 9mm pistol multiple times into the car. Guerrero Chapa, 43, was struck in the upper torso and died at the scene. Julia was not harmed. It was the first person to lose their life to violence in Southlake in over a decade.
Investigators learned within hours that Guerrero Chapa was not simply a resident of a wealthy suburb. He had spent years as the personal attorney for Osiel Cárdenas Guillén, the former leader of the Gulf Cartel, the man who founded Los Zetas as his personal enforcement arm. When Cárdenas Guillén was arrested in Mexico in 2003, captured after a gunfight with the Mexican military, he was eventually extradited to the United States in 2007. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to 5 federal charges including drug trafficking conspiracy and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. As part of his cooperation with U.S. investigators, he agreed to forfeit $50 million in criminal proceeds. Guerrero Chapa, as his attorney, was the person tasked with helping U.S. agencies locate and collect those assets. With his cartel boss behind bars and a target growing on his back from rival factions who viewed the cooperation as betrayal, Guerrero Chapa relocated his family to Texas.
U.S. authorities were aware of his situation. He became a cooperating source for the Department of Homeland Security, providing information about cartel operations. The U.S. government knew about the arrangement. Guerrero Chapa had received 2 separate phone calls, one in early 2011 and one roughly 2 years later, warning him that people had found him and intended to harm him. Each time he moved his family to a different location. After the second warning, the family moved to Southlake. The person who wanted Guerrero Chapa dead was José Rodolfo Villarreal Hernández, known as El Gato, the Cat, a regional leader of the Beltrán Leiva cartel in the Mexican state of Nuevo León. El Gato blamed Guerrero Chapa for the death of his own father, who had been connected to Gulf cartel operations in a town called China, Nuevo León. He had been hunting Guerrero Chapa since at least March 2011, which is when he hired a team to find him.
The operation to locate and eliminate Guerrero Chapa was methodical. El Gato paid a total of $1 million for the entire undertaking. He hired a Mexican private investigator named Jesus Gerardo Ledesma Cepeda, along with Ledesma Cepeda's son and a cousin, to track Guerrero Chapa across international lines. The team traveled from Mexico into the United States repeatedly over more than 2 years. They rented apartments in Grapevine, a neighboring town, to stay close to Southlake. They placed surveillance cameras in Guerrero Chapa's neighborhood. They attached GPS tracking devices to his vehicles, including switching the tracker on his Range Rover in a Walmart parking lot the afternoon of the day he was killed. They used binoculars to watch him and Julia from a parked car at the town square just minutes before the shooters arrived. El Gato sent 2 assassins from Mexico to complete the operation. They were identified in court testimony only by their nicknames, Clorox and Captain. Ledesma Cepeda's son testified that he met both men and knew why they were there.
The 2 carried out the shooting and fled. They have never been arrested. The 3 trackers, Ledesma Cepeda, his son, and the cousin, were arrested in September 2014 after investigators pieced together phone records, GPS data, and email communications that placed them at every point of the operation. El Gato's brother Ramon also pleaded guilty in 2022 for his role. Jesus Gerardo Ledesma Cepeda and José Luis Cepeda Cortez were each convicted at trial in May 2016 and sentenced to life in federal prison. Ledesma Campano, the son who testified for the government, received 20 years.
El Gato himself spent years as a fugitive, was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list in October 2020, was arrested in Mexico in January 2023, and extradited to the United States in February 2025 to face federal charges in the Northern District of Texas. The shooter and the getaway driver remain unidentified and free. The next case involves a man who testified openly in a U.S. federal courtroom and paid for it months later, not in hiding, but on a public road in broad daylight. Case 6. The decorated officer who survived the crash. Iván Morales Corrales. On the morning of May 1, 2015, Iván Morales Corrales was part of a secret military mission in the Mexican state of Jalisco. The objective was one of the most wanted men in North America, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, the founder and leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, a criminal organization that by 2015 was already distributing fentanyl and methamphetamine in quantities that would eventually make it one of the most significant drug trafficking threats the United States had ever faced. El Mencho had a $15 million U.S. government bounty on his head. 5 helicopters carried the joint military and federal police operation into cartel territory that morning. The one Morales was aboard was hit by rocket-propelled grenades while in flight. The aircraft came down burning. Of the 18 people on board, 9 survived. Morales survived, though barely. His uniform caught fire as he emerged from the wreckage. He removed his jacket and bulletproof vest and rolled on the ground until the flames went out. He was rescued and transported to Mexico's Central Military Hospital, where doctors placed him in a medically induced coma. He had sustained third-degree burns across 70% of his body. Over the following months and years, he underwent 15 reconstructive surgeries. In December 2015, then-President Enrique Peña Nieto awarded him the Police Medal of Merit for his conduct that day. What caused that helicopter to go down was not a random act of cartel violence. According to evidence later presented in a U.S. federal courtroom, it was a direct order. The man who gave it was Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, El Mencho's son, known as El Menchito, who directed cartel members to bring down the aircraft so that he and his father could avoid capture. El Menchito had been running the Jalisco New Generation Cartel as second in command under his father, overseeing international drug shipments, directing violence against rivals and subordinates, and personally committing acts that prosecutors would later detail extensively at trial. He was born in San Francisco, California in 1990 and held dual U.S.-Mexican citizenship. El Menchito was arrested by Mexican authorities in June 2015, weeks after the helicopter attack. He was released, re-arrested, released again, and eventually held in Mexican custody before Mexico's Secretariat of Foreign Affairs approved a U.S. extradition request. He arrived in American custody in February 2020. For the next several years, U.S. prosecutors built their case. In September 2024, a 2-week federal jury trial took place at the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Multiple witnesses testified, including former drug traffickers from rival organizations who had dealt directly with El Menchito, and a former Mexican federal police officer identified in court records only by the name Juan Perez to protect his identity. According to reporting confirmed by multiple outlets, Iván Morales Corrales was among those who testified, identifiable to those familiar with the 2015 attack by his disfigured face and his first-hand account of surviving the helicopter crash that El Menchito had ordered. On September 20, 2024, the jury convicted Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez on all charges: conspiracy to distribute cocaine and methamphetamine for importation into the United States, and using and carrying firearms, including destructive devices, in furtherance of the drug conspiracy. On March 7, 2025, U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell sentenced him to life in prison plus 30 years at the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Judge Howell also ordered the forfeiture of $6.26 billion in drug proceeds. El Menchito, 35 years old at sentencing, was subsequently transferred to ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado. His defense attorneys said they would appeal. Ivan Morales Corrales returned to Mexico. He had no protective security detail, no armored vehicle, no protocol to keep him safe now that he had testified in one of the highest-profile cartel prosecutions in recent history. On the morning of April 30, 2025, exactly 10 years and 1 day after the helicopter was brought down, Morales and his wife were driving through the municipality of Temixco in the state of Morelos, approximately 60 miles from Mexico City. A group of gunmen intercepted their vehicle. According to reports from El Diario de Morelos, the attackers fired 15 rounds into the car. Both Morales and his wife were struck multiple times and died at the scene. The attackers fled immediately on motorcycles that were waiting nearby. They have not been arrested. The Morelos State Attorney General's office confirmed the killings and opened an investigation, with revenge listed as a primary line of inquiry, given Morales' background and his recent testimony. A DEA agent later confirmed the connection publicly in a statement to Congress, saying that after El Menchito's capture and prosecution, his father's cartel struck back in Mexico. One key witness was eliminated along with his wife, the agent said. Separately, the daughter of another cooperating witness in the same case was also eliminated following El Menchito's sentencing in April 2025. The agent described the pattern as a cartel demonstrating that it could reach across borders with no hesitation. The U.S. government designated the Jalisco New Generation Cartel as a foreign terrorist organization in February 2025. El Mencho himself, who had overseen the helicopter attack a decade earlier and now had his son serving life in an American prison, remained at large at the time of Morales' elimination. No arrest had been made in the Temixco ambush as of the most recent confirmed reporting. Morales had survived a burning aircraft, 15 surgeries, and 10 years of carrying the physical evidence of what the cartel had done to him. He had sat in a U.S. courtroom and told the truth about what he witnessed. He went home, and the cartel found him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves away from retribution after testimony and into something more calculated. A cartel that used a hacker to intercept a federal agent's movements in real time, feeding that information directly to assassins waiting to act. Case 7. The City That Watched. How the Sinaloa cartel used a hacker to hunt informants. Most of the cases in this video involve cartels finding informants through corrupt officials, leaked documents, or newspaper articles. This one is different. This case, confirmed by the U.S. Department of Justice in a report published in June 2025, shows what happens when a cartel stops relying on people and starts relying on technology. It shows a drug organization using a hired hacker, a city's entire camera network, and a federal agent's own phone against the people trying to bring that organization down. The cartel at the center of this case is the Sinaloa cartel, built and led for decades by Joaquin Guzman Loera, known worldwide as El Chapo. By the time the events described in this case took place, El Chapo had already been extradited to the United States. He arrived on American soil in January 2017. His trial began in Brooklyn, New York in November 2018, and on February 12, 2019, a federal jury convicted him on all 10 counts, including operating a continuing criminal enterprise. On July 17, 2019, U.S. District Judge Brian Cogan sentenced him to life in prison plus 30 years and ordered the forfeiture of $12.6 billion. He was transferred to the federal supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, known as ADX Florence. But the Sinaloa cartel did not stop operating when El Chapo went to prison. The organization continued running, and it continued hunting informants. And according to the DOJ report, it was doing so using methods that American intelligence officials described as an existential threat. In June 2025, the Justice Department's Office of the Inspector General released a 47-page, partially redacted audit titled "The FBI's Efforts to Mitigate the Effects of Ubiquitous Technical Surveillance." Ubiquitous technical surveillance is the term the report uses to describe the widespread collection of data, call logs, GPS location, phone movement, camera footage, and how that data can be combined by anyone with the right access to build a detailed picture of a person's life, movements, and contacts. The report noted that this type of surveillance was no longer limited to governments. Criminal organizations had learned to use it. The case that the Inspector General highlighted involved the Sinaloa cartel in 2018, around the same time El Chapo's trial was getting underway in Brooklyn. The cartel recruited an unnamed hacker and set them to work against the FBI's operations in Mexico City. The hacker's first task was observation, watching the U.S. Embassy. By monitoring who came in and out of the building, the hacker was able to identify people of interest to the cartel, specifically people who might be connected to American law enforcement operations targeting the organization. From that surveillance, the hacker identified the FBI's Assistant Legal Attaché in Mexico City. An Assistant Legal Attaché, referred to in the report as an ALAT, is a senior FBI official who works closely with Mexican law enforcement, coordinates joint operations, and is a central figure in how the FBI gathers intelligence on cartel activity in Mexico. The hacker obtained this official's phone number. Using that number, the hacker was able to access the incoming and outgoing call records of the official's phone, as well as the phone's geolocation data. This meant the hacker could see where the FBI official was at any given time. That alone would have been significant, but the hacker went further. According to the Inspector General's report, the hacker also accessed Mexico City's surveillance camera system, the network of cameras installed throughout the city to monitor public spaces, streets, and intersections. Using those cameras, the hacker followed the FBI official through the city. Wherever the official went, the cameras tracked them. And whoever the official met, on a street corner, in a cafe, at any location visible to the camera network, was identified. Those were the people the cartel was looking for. The report stated plainly what the cartel did with that information. According to the FBI case agents cited in the report, the cartel used the data to intimidate and, in some instances, eliminate potential sources or cooperating witnesses. The hacker, the official, and the victims were not identified by name in the report. The identities remain redacted. What the report makes clear is that this was not a single isolated incident. It was presented by the Inspector General as a case study in a broader documented pattern. The FBI had been warned about threats from this type of surveillance as far back as 2022, when an earlier Inspector General review found the Bureau's approach to protecting its people and sources from this kind of exposure was, in the report's words, disjointed and inconsistent. The cartel had found and exploited that gap. The report also noted that some officials within the FBI and its partner agencies, including the CIA, had described the threat posed by this type of commercial surveillance technology to ongoing operations as existential. That is not a word that gets used lightly inside federal law enforcement. It means that the ability of any intelligence or law enforcement agency to run a source, to find someone willing to cooperate and keep them alive long enough to be useful, is fundamentally threatened
by what a mid-level hacker with access to public camera systems and phone data can now accomplish for a cartel. The FBI told the Inspector General it was working on a strategic plan to address the vulnerabilities identified in the report. Several recommendations were made. Specific details of the plan remained classified as of the report's publication. El Chapo has been at ADX Florence since July 2019. He will not leave. His sons, including Joaquin Guzman Lopez and Ovidio Guzman Lopez, are in U.S. custody. The organization they were part of building continued functioning after every arrest.
The hacker who helped the cartel find and eliminate cooperating witnesses in Mexico City has never been publicly identified. The people who were located and removed through the city's own camera network have no names attached to their cases in any public record. They cooperated with the FBI. The city they lived in helped the cartel find them. The next case on this list involves a man whose cover was not broken by hackers or corrupt officials, but by a phone number he paid for himself. Case 8. The DEA Source and the 11. Néstor Isidro Pérez Salas. The Sinaloa cartel's most violent enforcement arm had a name. It was called the Ninis, taken from a Mexican slang phrase for young people who neither study nor work. Despite that casual name, the group was one of the most heavily armed and ruthlessly organized security units in the history of Mexican organized crime. They carried machine guns and rocket launchers. They served as the personal protection force for the Chapitos, the sons of imprisoned Sinaloa cartel leader Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, and they answered directly to one man, Néstor Isidro Pérez Salas, known as El Nini. El Nini was 32 years old when Mexican authorities arrested him in Culiacán, Mexico, on November 22, 2023. By that point, U.S. federal prosecutors had already indicted him twice, once in Washington, D.C., and once in the Southern District of New York. The charges covered cocaine and methamphetamine importation, fentanyl trafficking, firearms offenses, money laundering, and something less commonly charged in American courts, conspiracy to obstruct justice by carrying out a targeted elimination campaign against a DEA confidential source and everyone around them. The DEA source at the center of this case was providing information directly to American investigators in connection with a U.S. federal investigation into Pérez Salas and his associates in the Southern District of New York. The source's identity, like all the others in this video, remained protected in court documents. What the documents do reveal is the sequence of events that followed once Pérez Salas and the Chapitos determined the source existed and had been cooperating. In October 2023, Pérez Salas and a team of Ninis operatives located the DEA confidential source in Mexico. They also believed they had identified people connected to that source, relatives, associates, anyone who could be linked to the cooperation. A total of 11 people were taken, including the source and a U.S. citizen. 8 of those 11 people were eliminated, including the DEA source and a 13-year-old boy. According to the federal indictments, the eliminations were carried out in direct retaliation for the confidential source's provision of information to law enforcement. Pérez Salas was arrested by Mexican authorities just weeks after this operation on November 22, 2023. He was extradited to the United States on May 25, 2024. He was arraigned in New York before U.S. Magistrate Judge Ona T. Wang and faced charges in 2 separate federal courts simultaneously. In the District of Columbia, the charges included cocaine and methamphetamine importation conspiracy, firearms offenses including machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to obstruct justice through elimination. In the Southern District of New York, he faced leadership of a continuing criminal enterprise resulting in the deaths of numerous victims, including a DEA confidential source, fentanyl importation and trafficking,
obstruction of justice by eliminating an informant, and kidnapping, resulting in 8 deaths, including a minor. Each of the most serious charges carries a mandatory minimum of life in prison.
Attorney General Merrick Garland, announcing the extradition, stated that Nini was responsible for the elimination, abuse, and kidnapping of rivals and witnesses who threatened the cartel's drug trafficking enterprise. FBI Director Christopher Wray described him as the primary enforcer of the Sinaloa cartel's security apparatus. The former head of international operations for the DEA, Mike Vigil, described Perez Salas publicly as a complete psychopath. The violence attributed to Perez Salas in the indictment extended well beyond the October 2023 operation. In 2017, he and 2 of the Chapitos allegedly captured, interrogated, and eliminated 2 Mexican federal law enforcement officers. Also in 2017, he and others conspired to retaliate against a separate witness and informant. In 2022, he and another Nini's operative allegedly tested the potency of fentanyl pills on human subjects. In the summer of 2022, associates under his direction sold fentanyl to a DEA operation in Los Angeles, which was later seized. The indictment described a pattern of systematic brutality that extended across years and reached into the United States. The Chapitos, Iván Archibaldo Guzmán Salazar, Jesús Alfredo Guzmán Salazar, and Ovidio Guzmán López, are the sons of El Chapo, who is currently serving a life sentence plus 30 years at ADX Florence in Colorado, having been convicted in Brooklyn in February 2019 and sentenced in July 2019. Ovidio Guzmán López was extradited to the United States in July 2023 and entered a guilty plea in Chicago in December 2024. The U.S. government offered a $10 million reward for the capture of Iván Archibaldo and Jesús Alfredo, as of the most recent confirmed reporting. According to U.S. court documents, the Chapitos' operations during this period included fentanyl manufacturing on an industrial scale and distribution into the United States through sophisticated smuggling networks. The Ninis served as the armed force that protected that operation, removed threats to it, and eliminated anyone, inside or outside the cartel, who the Chapitos believed had spoken to American authorities. The DEA confidential source, who was located and eliminated in October 2023, had been providing information specifically connected to an active federal prosecution in New York. They were cooperating with U.S. law enforcement while located in Mexico, with no apparent protective security arrangement capable of keeping them safe once Perez Salas identified them. The source's name does not appear in any public court record. 8 of the 11 people taken that month are dead. Perez Salas remains in U.S. federal custody as of the most recent confirmed information. His case is being prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice Criminal Division's Narcotic and Dangerous Drugs Section in the District of Columbia and the Southern District of New York. No trial date had been publicly confirmed as of this writing. The case that follows this one involves not a cartel operating in the shadows, but the highest-ranking Mexican law enforcement official ever tried in a United States federal court. A man whose cooperation with cartels may have directly contributed to an informant's end. Case 9. Mexico's top cop, Genaro Garcia Luna, and the informant he helped expose. For more than a decade, Genaro Garcia Luna was the man the United States trusted most in Mexico. He was the architect of Mexico's militarized war on drug cartels, the official who sat across the table from DEA agents, FBI directors, and U.S. secretaries of state, coordinating operations against the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America. Presidents Felipe Calderón on the Mexican side and George W. Bush on the American side both treated him as a key partner. When Calderón launched his crackdown on cartels in 2006, Garcia Luna was the man he put in charge of the federal police force and the country's entire public security apparatus. He was also, according to a federal jury in Brooklyn, working for the cartel the entire time. Garcia Luna was born in Mexico City in 1968. His career in law enforcement started in Mexico's intelligence services before he moved into federal police work. From 2001 to 2005, he led the Federal Investigation Agency, known by its Spanish acronym AFI, essentially Mexico's equivalent of the FBI. In 2006, President Calderón elevated him to Secretary of Public Security, giving him control of Mexico's federal police force and the vast intelligence infrastructure that supported it. In that role, he worked directly alongside the DEA and shared the most sensitive information American agents collected about cartel activities in Mexico. According to evidence presented at his trial, the arrangement worked in reverse as well. Garcia Luna took that same sensitive information, intelligence about operations, about informants, about pending arrests, and passed it to the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for tens of millions of dollars in bribes. Prosecutors called him the cartel's most valuable asset. In one exchange cited at trial, a single intelligence report Garcia Luna provided to the cartel saved it approximately $50 million in losses from a major cocaine seizure, because the report revealed the source of the law enforcement tip that led to the bust. The bribe payments were made in cash. On 2 occasions, according to court testimony from multiple cartel witnesses, the Sinaloa cartel delivered briefcases containing between $3 and $5 million each directly to Garcia Luna. He received payments in a variety of locations: at a safe house in Mexico City where cash was hidden behind a false wall, at a car wash in Guadalajara, and at a French restaurant in Mexico City across the street from the U.S. Embassy. By the time he left office in 2012 and relocated first to Miami and then to Dallas, federal prosecutors say he had accumulated a personal fortune of millions of dollars that could not be explained by his government salary. In 2018, he applied for U.S. citizenship. On his naturalization paperwork, he lied about his criminal activities. That application would later become one of the charges against him. The Colombian informant at the center of this case cooperated with U.S. law enforcement while embedded in the Beltran Leyva organization, a cartel that for years operated in alliance with the Sinaloa cartel before the 2 groups broke apart violently in 2008. Between 2007 and 2008, for a period of roughly 6 to 7 months, Beltran Leyva cocaine shipments arriving from Colombia by speedboat and submarine were repeatedly intercepted by the DEA. The cartel was certain someone inside their operation was feeding information to American agents. They were right. According to testimony given in U.S. federal court by Sergio Villarreal Barragan, a senior Beltran Leyva lieutenant known as El Grande, who later cooperated with U.S. prosecutors, the cartel turned to corrupt Mexican federal police officials to help identify the source. A meeting was called. Multiple Mexican law enforcement officers attended, along with cartel leadership. At that meeting, Garcia Luna's subordinate and close associate, Luis Cardenas Palomino, told the cartel that he had spoken with Garcia Luna personally. According to El Grande's testimony, Garcia Luna obtained the informant's identity through a Mexican federal police officer stationed in Colombia. The identifying information, including a photograph, was brought to a meeting with Arturo Beltran Leyva himself. Seeing the photograph, Beltran Leyva ordered the informant taken immediately. 2 senior Beltran Leyva lieutenants located the man in a city in central Mexico, took him, interrogated him, and eliminated him. Garcia Luna was not charged with the informant's death, but the allegation that he provided access to the information that led to it was presented as part of the broader pattern of conduct, giving cartel members access to sensitive law enforcement intelligence in exchange for payment. Federal agents in Houston began building a case against Garcia Luna around 2010 2 years before he left office. They had enough to bring to the head of the DEA by 2011. The case stalled repeatedly as prosecutors in Houston declined to move forward, finding the evidence insufficient for a conviction of someone at Garcia Luna's level. The case finally gained traction after the 2018 trial of El Chapo, when a former Sinaloa lieutenant testified in open court that he had personally delivered more than $6 million in cash to Garcia Luna on behalf of the cartel. Federal prosecutors in Brooklyn moved quickly after that testimony. Garcia Luna was arrested on December 9, 2019, by federal agents in Dallas, Texas. He was transferred to Brooklyn and pleaded not guilty. His trial began in January 2023. Over 4 weeks, 9 of the 26 government witnesses were former cartel members, including El Grande and senior Sinaloa figures who testified to personally delivering or witnessing bribe payments. Garcia Luna's defense argued that all of the witnesses were criminals who had motive to lie in exchange for reduced sentences. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a guilty verdict on all 5 counts on February 21, 2023. U.S. District Judge Brian Cogan sentenced Garcia Luna on October 16, 2024 to 460 months, 38 years and 4 months in federal prison, along with a $2 million fine. Prosecutors had sought a life sentence. In his remarks from the bench, Judge Cogan told Garcia Luna, "Aside from your pleasant demeanor and your articulateness, you have the same kind of thuggishness as El Chapo. It just manifests itself in a different way." Garcia Luna maintained his innocence. His attorney said they would appeal. He remains in federal custody. The Colombian informant he helped expose has no public name, no memorial, and no case number connected to justice for what was done to them. The final case in this video takes us back to the most basic question running through all 10 of these stories. What happens when the cartel's reach extends not just across a border, but across decades, making it clear that no amount of time or distance is ever truly enough? Case 10. The Forgotten Pilot, Alfredo Zavala Avelar. Every case in this video has a name people know, or at least a government that cared enough to fight for justice. This one is different. This case is about the man who flew the plane, took the photographs, and helped bring down one of the most profitable illegal operations in Mexican history, and who, when it was over, was reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. His name was Captain Alfredo Zavala Avelar. He was a professional pilot employed by the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture and Water Resources, known by its Spanish abbreviation SARH. His job, on paper, was government aviation work. In practice, by the early 1980s, he had become a trusted collaborator of DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena, the agent who would later become one of the most recognized names in the history of American drug enforcement. Zavala's role in what Camarena was building was not minor. He flew surveillance missions over remote stretches of Mexican territory as part of American-supported crop eradication programs. He worked the Guadalajara airport regularly, and because of that, he was in a position to monitor the private planes used by cartel leadership, specifically those connected to Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and Rafael Caro Quintero, 2 of the 3 founders of the Guadalajara cartel. Zavala would observe their aircraft movements and report what he saw back to Camarena. He was, in every practical sense, a DEA asset operating inside Mexico at significant personal risk. The information Zavala gathered fed directly into Camarena's most important investigation. Camarena had spent years tracking a massive marijuana operation that cartel figures, including Caro Quintero, had built in the state of Chihuahua, a 2,500-acre property known as Rancho Buffalo. Zavala flew Camarena over the ranch
and helped capture the aerial reconnaissance photographs that proved the operation's scale and gave the DEA and Mexican federal authorities the hard evidence they needed.
In November 1984, acting on that intelligence, Mexican military and federal forces raided Rancho Buffalo. They burned more than 10,000 tons of marijuana and made 177 arrests. The financial loss to Caro Quintero was estimated at approximately $160 million. The cartel knew retaliation was coming. What they needed was to find out how much the DEA actually knew and who had been talking. On the afternoon of February 7, 1985, Camarena left the DEA offices inside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara to meet his wife for lunch. He never arrived. 5 armed men stopped him on the street and forced him into a vehicle. At almost exactly the same time, across the city at the Guadalajara airport, Zavala's plane had just landed. He had been transporting a group of businessmen from Durango who offered him a ride home. Zavala accepted. Somewhere on the Chapala Highway heading into the city, a brown Ford LTD intercepted the vehicle. Armed men got out, pulled Zavala from the car, removed the other men's keys and threw them into a field, and drove away with him. Both men were taken to a residence at 881 Lope de Vega in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood of Guadalajara, a property owned by Caro Quintero. They were held there and subjected to a prolonged interrogation that lasted more than 30 hours. Both men were killed on or around February 9, 1985. A forensic examination conducted after their bodies were recovered confirmed that both died from blunt force injuries to the head and neck, and that both had sustained extensive physical injuries across their bodies. Their bodies were not found immediately. The cartel moved them. On March 5, 1985, a rancher near the village of La Angostura in the state of Michoacán, roughly 60 miles from Guadalajara, followed a smell to a field near a ranch called El Mareno and found 2 bodies wrapped in plastic. They were blindfolded, bound, and gagged. A few hours later, Mexican media confirmed the identities: Enrique Camarena and Alfredo Zavala Avelar. The 3 cartel leaders most directly responsible were all convicted in Mexican courts and sentenced to 40 years in prison each. Rafael Caro Quintero was arrested in Costa Rica in April 1985. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Neto, was arrested in Puerto Vallarta on April 7, 1985. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was arrested in 1989. In 2022, a Mexican court issued an injunction that blocked Fonseca Carrillo from having to pay 20.8 million pesos, approximately $1.2 million, in restitution owed to the families of both Camarena and Zavala. On April 5, 2025, having turned 95 years old and served the final years of his sentence under house arrest due to severe health conditions, Fonseca Carrillo was released. Caro Quintero had already been extradited to the United States on February 27, 2025, as part of a transfer of 29 cartel figures to American authorities. Felix Gallardo remains imprisoned in Mexico, with a release date currently set for 2029. In March 2025, the Camarena family filed a civil lawsuit in U.S. federal court in San Diego, naming Caro Quintero, Fonseca Carrillo, Felix Gallardo, and the Sinaloa cartel as defendants. The lawsuit names Zavala Avelar in the complaint, acknowledging that he and Camarena were taken together, held together, and died together. The DEA continued its Red Ribbon Week awareness campaign in Camarena's honor every October. No equivalent recognition exists for Zavala. There is no ceremony. No memorial program carries his name. In Mexico, a Spanish-language headline from years after his death put it plainly: Alfredo Zavala, el piloto olvidado por México y EU. Alfredo Zavala, the pilot forgotten by Mexico and the United States.
He worked alongside Camarena for years. He flew the missions. He took the photographs that led to the largest marijuana seizure in Mexican history at that time. He was taken on the same day, held in the same building, and found in the same field. He left behind a wife who reported him missing when he never came home from the airport. His name appears in court documents, in a single paragraph of the March 2025 civil complaint, and in almost nothing else. 10 cases, 10 people who provided information to law enforcement and paid for it with their lives. Some are remembered as heroes. Some were used and discarded. Some never had a name attached to their case in any public record. What runs through all of them is a single, unchanged fact. The people who chose to cooperate paid a price that no one who asked them to cooperate ever had to pay themselves. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.